Hello, I am Ivan Ruddock, President of Kirkintilloch and District Society of Antiquaries. And in this short talk, I will describe the life and career of Archibald Scott Couper, who I refer to as Kirkintilloch's forgotten pioneer of chemistry. The structure of my talk is as follows. I'll say something about organic chemistry and its importance, and then outline Archibald Scott Couper's early life, his brief career as a chemist, his downfall, his last days in Kirkintilloch, his miraculous rediscovery, and any monuments and legacy associated with him. So what is organic chemistry? Well, the term organic chemistry is the name given in the 19th century to the chemistry of substances of animal and plant origin. Then in 1828, the first artificial organic compound was synthesized. But this terminology of organic chemistry has been retained to the present day, with the modern meaning being the chemistry of compounds of carbon. Organic molecules comprise many atoms, but only of a few different kinds. Now, they're normally carbon, usually hydrogen, a small number of others. And these atoms are arranged in complicated but regular patterns. A good example is the molecule of benzene, which is shown here. It's only comprised of carbon and hydrogen, but they're arranged in a hexagonal pattern. So is the organic chemistry industry important? Well, what we normally think of as the chemical industry is really the organic chemistry industry. And it comprises such diverse areas as oil and gas, plastics, food and drink, pharmaceuticals, toiletries, and cosmetics. There's an annual turnover of about £50 billion. It supports about 500,000 jobs directly and indirectly. It's the largest exporter of manufactured goods ahead of the motor industry and aerospace. There's a £5 billion per annum spend on research and development, and about £2 billion is spent annually on capital infrastructure. Now let's look at Archibald Scott Couper's early life. He was born on 31st of March 1831 and grew up in 25 Townhead, Kirkintilloch. He was the only surviving son of Archibald Couper and Helen Dollar. His father, Archibald Couper, was proprietor of a cotton weaving business inherited from his own father. And Archibald Scott Couper got his middle name, Scott, from his paternal grandmother, Janet Scott. The white building in the photograph is 25 Townhead, and above the door is a plaque to Archibald Scott Couper, but I'll say something about it in a few minutes' time. Well, Archibald was first educated at home, and then he traveled in Europe. For example, in summer of 1851, aged 20, he was in Germany to study German. Then he entered the University of Glasgow for the winter of 1851 to 1852 and studied Latin and Greek. At that time, the University of Glasgow was in its old location on High Street. And this photograph from that time shows the view looking from the quadrangle westwards, and through the archway at the bottom of the tower is the present-day High Street. He spent the following summer in Germany again, in Berlin, and then he entered the University of Edinburgh in the winter of 1852 and spent 3 years and graduated MA in Philosophy and Logic. And at that time, he would have studied in the old college on South Bridge Street, Edinburgh, shown here in this print. But meanwhile, in the summers, he traveled to Europe. For example, the summer of 1853, he toured southern Germany and northern Italy. After graduating from Edinburgh, he spent one further year in Germany from the summer of 1855 through to the following summer, studying chemistry. And that appears to be the only formal study he ever undertook of the subject. And in the summer of 1856, he then moved to Paris and succeeded in getting a job in the laboratory of Professor Charles Otto Wirtz in the medical school. Wirtz is shown in the lower left-hand photograph, And the lower right-hand photograph shows the building that Couper would have worked in the 1850s. It's still owned by the University of Paris, but is no longer used for its original purpose. Wurtz was the professor for organic chemistry in the medical school. He later became the first professor for organic chemistry in the Sorbonne, which is the original part of the University of Paris. He was founder and later president of the Paris Chemical Society. He became president of the French Academy of Sciences in 1881, and towards the end of his life, he became a senator in the Republic of France. But what did his contemporaries think of Couper in their letters and any surviving writings? Well, they described him as a very handsome man, tall and slender, of a distinguished aristocratic aspect. He had no appearance of weakness, but his health was delicate, and I've heard that his mother was always anxious about him. His character, as is often the case with Scotsmen, was deeply religious. He was very fond of music, classical, serious, and lively, and seldom missed a good concert in Berlin. The photograph shown here is about the time he was in Paris, but this is the only surviving photograph. And although I also show a sketch, that sketch is based on the photograph. Well, let's look at Archibald Scott Couper's career in Paris. And you see that it was exceptionally short, just 2 years. The most miraculous thing about Couper's career was that after only 1 year of studying chemistry in Berlin, he then did independent research immediately on arrival in Wurtz's laboratory in Paris. This was not what you normally call physical chemistry, just mixing chemicals together in test tubes and seeing what happens. This was cutting-edge research, a new subject of organic chemistry, and it was a theoretical piece of work about how carbon atoms could form organic molecules. And he also proposed the modern way of visualizing chemical structure and chemical bonds. But by the summer of 1858, in fact, the spring of 1858, he had completed on a new chemical theory. And he wanted to have it published in a prestigious journal. And the one he thought of was the Journal of the French Academy of Sciences, but it requires submission by a member of the Academy. Unfortunately, his boss Wurtz was not a member, but for some reason or other, he delayed in passing it to somebody who was. But eventually, Couper's paper was published on the 14th of June, 1858, in the Academy's journal. That would give the impression that Couper's career was all set for progress. But unfortunately, this man, Friedrich August Kirkintilloch, a contemporary, was working in a similar area. Kirkintilloch had studied in Gießen in Germany and other European universities, including Paris. He then went on to work in the universities of Heidelberg, Ghent, and Bonn. And in Bonn, he spent nearly 30 years and came to the end of his career there on his death. Now, a significant feature of his time in Paris was that he worked with Wurtz. So Wurtz and Kirkintilloch knew each other, and a friendship had developed between them. So while Couper was working on his new chemical theory, Kirkintilloch was also working on the nature of carbon atoms in organic molecules and chemical bonding. So he managed to publish in May of 1858 the paper on the constitution and metamorphosis of chemical compounds and on the chemical nature of carbon in a German chemical journal. Very, very similar area, but the significant point is that it was published almost 1 month before Couper's June 1858 paper on a new chemical theory. Now, taken together, these papers launched modern organic chemistry, but the significant feature as far as Couper was concerned is that priority is paramount in scientific research. And any paper in a scientific journal has the date of submission to the journal, it has the date of acceptance by the journal, as well as the date of publication in the journal. So priority is significant when it comes to the award of prizes, the Nobel Prize, for example, and just reputation. Well, on finding that he had been pipped at the post, Couper took Wirtz to task for delaying the submission. And the resultant row ended up the only way it could do, and that was with Wirtz sacking Couper. Of course, at this distance from the events, we have no idea if Wirtz deliberately delayed passing the paper to members of the Academy, or it just lay in his desk and he had forgotten about it. But the net result was that Couper was fired, and in the autumn of 1858, Couper returned to Scotland, perhaps a broken man, but this was effectively the end of Couper's career, but not the end of his story. Now let's look at the last days of Couper after he returned to Scotland in the autumn of 1858. Well, he did succeed in getting a job. He was offered a post of laboratory assistant in the University of Edinburgh in the laboratory of Professor Lyon Playfair, with very good terms. The terms were a salary of £100 per annum, private research to be conducted outside working hours of 9 to 4 in winter and 10 to 5 in summer, with 6 weeks vacation. His new boss, Lyon Playfair, was also a very significant person. He later became Liberal MP. He was Postmaster General, Deputy Speaker of the House of Commons, and in 1892 was raised to the peerage as Lord Playfair of St Andrews. But unfortunately, within a few months, Archibald Scott Couper suffered a mental breakdown. He was in and out of asylums from the following year, May 1859, through to November 1862. Meanwhile, his father had died when he was in an asylum. He returned to his mother on being discharged in 1862. He lived at home, and he may well have dabbled in chemistry, because the local paper, the Kirkintilloch Herald, reported in the 1920s that a local man had confessed to having vandalized his garden shed and glass equipment within it. So when he returned to his mother, he lived again in 25 Town Head, shown here the White Building. But then in 1880, as a widow, his mother built this house, Laurel Bank in Coxale Avenue, Kirkintilloch, on the corner with Bellevue Road. And that's where Archibald Scott Couper saw out his last days to his death in 1892. Local reports in the newspaper at the time of his death and at the time of the centenary of his birth refer to him having taken daily walks with a companion. He wrote letters, read the Bible to the household, and attended the Park Church. Now, those listening to this talk will be aware that the Park Church is the present-day Park Centre where the Antiquaries has its monthly meetings. He was referred to as a harmless loony and a madman, but died unmarried at Laurel Bank on the 11th of March 1892, aged just 60. And his mother died a few years later, aged 93. The Couper grave is well worth going to see in the Old Isle Cemetery, Kirkintilloch, and it was raised by his mother, and her name is there along with an infant son, John Couper, her own husband, Archibald Scott Couper, and his sister, Janet Couper. It's significant that this part of the Old Isle Cemetery has other important graves, and one worth going to see very nearby is that of Alexander Bain, the pioneering telegraph engineer and the developer of the line scan in television, and who recently was awarded the posthumous Emmy. Now, that could have been the end of Archibald Scott Couper's career, but he was rediscovered. And the first steps in the rediscovery took place very soon after his death. And we have this person to thank, Richard Anschutz, who is professor of chemistry in the University of Bonn. He was Kekele's successor in the University of Bonn. And in 1893, he discovered the 1858 paper that Couper had written in French by Monsieur A. Couper. He had reproduced Couper's results, and these results had been disputed by others, including Kekele. Then, 10 years later, he was writing Kekele's biography as his successor, and he rediscovered Couper's 1858 paper. And he had realized this significant scientist had vanished without trace. He wasn't in any national dictionary of biography or chemical handbooks. He just vanished. And he'd asked himself, well, was Couper still alive? And if so, where could he be? Well, with the name Archibald, he assumed then there's some link with Scotland, and he got his friend, Professor Alexander Crumb Brown in the University of Edinburgh, to undertake some inquiries. Now, Crumb Brown was Lion Playfair's successor, so there was an element of symmetry here in this later part of Couper's story. And after Crumb Brown's researches, then Anschutz wrote a critical review of Couper's work and also his life and career in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1909. So here is Alexander Crumb Brown, who became then Professor of Organic Chemistry after Lion Playfair. So what did he do in his researches? Well, the first step was to ask around. He asked fellow British scientists and eventually got contacting a distant family of Couper and various acquaintances. He checked with the University of Edinburgh, but it held no personal information other than Couper appearing in class lists. But he managed to find a former colleague in Playfair's laboratory who had suggested there had been mental illness because this former colleague had met Couper at Dunoon during a period of his breakdown. And then the Board of Lunacy, which is a nice politically correct name for the local health board, I suppose, the Board of Lunacy provided dates of admission to the asylums that Couper had been an inmate in, and his home addresses in Kirkintilloch. So Crumb Brown came over to Kirkintilloch to meet Couper's cousins. And in fact, he created a bit of a scene outside of 25 Townhead because it was now a barber shop, and he felt there should be some sign there to mark this important scientist's birthplace. And when he was in Kirkintilloch, he photographed various sites, the houses and the Old Isle Cemetery. And here is Crumb Brown's photograph in 1906 of Laurelbank. And the inset is my photograph of Laurelbank these days. So is there any monuments or legacy associated then with Archibald Scott Couper? Well, I said there's a plaque above the door of 25 Townhead, and here it is shown in the inset. And it reads, this plaque marks the birthplace of Archibald Scott Couper, whose brilliant pioneering contributions to chemical theory have won for him international renown, and whose genius, stifled by an early illness, was denied the opportunity of consummation. Erected by public subscription on the occasion of the centenary of his birth, 31st of March, 1931. Although it says erected on the centenary of his birth, it was erected in the year of the centenary because the actual unveiling of it was in the October of 1931. And this dedication of the plaque was part of a day's celebrations linked to Couper. There had been some local people in Kirkintilloch who had written to the newspaper and presumably to the council as well to actually get this off the ground in the 1930s. The plaque was unveiled by Professor Henderson of the chemical department, the chemistry department at the University of Glasgow, and James Rutherford, Kirkintilloch's provost, presided at this stage of the day's events. And then after this, there was a dinner with more speeches at the miners' welfare in Kirkintilloch. The day was rounded off with a public meeting in the evening in the town hall. The town hall, as it was in the early days of the 20th century, shown here, but again, local people will know that this was closed for a number of years, but is now reopened and refurbished as a conference, cultural centre, and as an exhibition venue as well. The public meeting was promoted by the Institute of Chemistry and the Society of Chemical Industry. And with so many chemists present, the chair, who was the previous provost, David Perry, said it was safe in saying that never in the town hall's history had there been so much science in it as tonight. The guest of honour was Sir James Irving, who himself was a chemist, and he was principal of the University of St Andrews. And a couple of quotations from his speech sum up Couper very well. Couper was one of the most brilliant scientific thinkers of the 19th century. He set down two fundamental postulates on which the whole fabric of modern organic chemistry rests. And the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Then in 1958, the centenary of Kirkintilloch and Couper's papers was also marked by the American Chemical Society in its Chicago meeting. And this Chicago meeting was called the Kirkintilloch-Couper Centennial Celebration. And both papers have been published, if you remember, in 1858, May and June, respectively. Now, I've seen how Couper's life developed. He returned after only 2 short years in Paris. He never really worked again. He suffered from mental illness and he lived at home until his death. Let's see what happened to Kirkintilloch. Well, Kirkintilloch became one of the most famous scientists of the 19th century, primarily due to his later work on deducing the ring structure of benzene in 1865. And that work was celebrated in 1965 on its centenary by, for example, the issuing of stamps across Europe. And the extreme left is that issued in East Germany. The middle is that issued by West Germany, and the right-hand one by Belgium. He was celebrated by his own university, by a statue erected, and that's erected outside of the building that bears his name, which was the building that housed the Department of Chemistry. He was ennobled by the Kaiser in 1895 as Friedrich August Kirkintilloch von Stradnitz. And also in Bonn, there is a street named after him, Kirkintillochstrasse. Branschols, in his paper in 1909, which he brought together Couper's work along with a review of his career and life as well, he wrote, Archibald Scott Couper is one of the most singular appearances in the history of the development of organic chemistry in the 19th century. His 2 experimental investigations were published within the limits of 1 year, and then with startling suddenness, his scientific career comes to an end. But there could have been another end to the story, because both men, Couper and Kirkintilloch, could have lived well into the 20th century. And the first Nobel Prize for Chemistry was awarded in 1901. I think it's quite reasonable to speculate that if both men had lived into the 20th century, they could well have shared a Nobel Prize for Chemistry for their pioneering work in organic chemistry. That would have been an amazing achievement, certainly for Archibald Scott Couper, having been born in Kirkintilloch and later having died in Kirkintilloch. So that brings me to the end of my story of Archibald Scott Couper, and I think he can be described as Kirkintilloch's forgotten pioneer of chemistry. I think chemists suffer to some extent because unless one is a chemist, the names generally are forgotten. The names are not linked to units of measurement, for example, like physicists. In physics, we have the Newton, unit of force, the Kelvin, the unit of temperature, the farad, the unit of electrical capacitance, and so on. But chemists tend to disappear. So that's why I have called him Kirkintilloch's forgotten pioneer of chemistry, even though his centenary of his birth was marked and centenary of his work has been marked. Thank you very much for listening.